Okay, so before going into the details, I thought about making the first slide as why should we bother about sleep disturbances in addiction medicine. So we all know that substances of abuse have lots of disruptive effects on sleep, particularly in terms of initiation, maintenance, as well as sleep architecture. There are consequent effects on the next day functioning and alertness, as well as disturbance which occur both during the abuse as well as in the withdrawal. So now the question comes is that are there any contributory role of sleep in substance abuse use disorders? Number one, and can treating the sleep issues alter the risk for substance abuse, or like whether can we have any new avenue for treatment or management of cases of substance abuse? Also, just the other side of the coin is that prevalence of insomnia in the general population is quite high, ranges between 6 to 30%, depending upon what criteria you are using. Most stringent criteria as of DSM-5 reduces to 6%, whereas some loose criteria presents as up to 30% prevalence. Now, the large proportion of these people who are insomniacs or who are suffering from insomnia, they self-medicate with various drugs, mostly which are legal drugs, for example, alcohol, sleeping pills, etc. So while some of them graduate to cannabis or opioids also. Many of them, to make matters worse, are prescribed benzodiazepines or barbiturates by physicians, who are then continued indefinitely by the patient who does not, who stop going to the doctor and instead go to the chemist or pharmacist and get a refill of the prescriptions for an endless period of time. So the questions that arise from these particular events are: does it give rise to substance use disorder? Do we call them substance use disorder? If this kind of pill taking, how many of them fall in the ambit of addiction per se? And what is the role of therapy seeking versus drug seeking behavior? And is separating these two that much easy in clinical practice? So, before going into the details of these, I'd like to just have a very brief and rapid overview of the current nosological status, both from the terms of addiction medicine as well as from terms of sleep medicine. We all know the criteria for substance dependence in DSM-4-TR. I won't go into details, but the point to be noted is that there is no mention of sleep or sleep problems absolutely in the entire criteria. Now, if we come to the other aspect of sleep disorder classifications, we can see here that International Classification of Sleep Disorders, third edition, with the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and this is the latest diagnostic criteria in the field of sleep medicine, and who defined insomnia as difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep or awakening early in the morning for 3 or more nights per week, which endures for 3 months or more and causes significant impairment in daytime functioning. Also, DSM-5 also mentions that insomnia is classified as a comorbid with specific substance use disorder if it occurs beyond the immediate substance use, in the chapter of sleep disorders in DSM-5. And while ICD-3 lists insomnia due to drugs or substances as one of the subtypes of insomnia. So, if we try to just excuse me. Sorry. If we try to differentiate between drug seeking and therapy seeking, we'll find that drug seeking is defined as a particular pattern of behavior in which the focus of the patient is on the drug and its effects, typically its euphorogenic effects, and whereas in therapy seeking, the typical focus of the patient is on the disorder or the condition that is being treated for, that is for which the drug is being used. Now, in drug seeking type of behavior, drug is taken in excessive amounts, often in non-therapeutic contexts, for example in daytime, for say sleeping pills are being taken in daytime just to get the kick, as we have seen in the previous case presentation. Also, it is preferred over other commodities like money and other social and occupational activities, again that we have seen in the previous case presentation. On the other hand, therapy seeking behavior is characterized by the signs and symptoms of the appropriate diagnosis of the indicated drug, and the pattern of drug taking, including its dose, timing, and duration of use, are consistent with its therapeutic effects. All of us have seen numerous patients in clinical practice who have been using say 0.5 mg or 1 mg of Trica or Alprax for 5 years, 10 years, like that, without the need for escalating the dose, but also they will need the medicine. Without the medicine, they won't be able to fall asleep. So that is a classical presentation of therapy seeking behavior. However, there is this concept that therapy seeking and drug seeking can become closely intertwined and shift between each other quite often. Like I'd like to give a couple of examples. Firstly, in therapy seeking, shifting into drug seeking behavior is when, say, alcohol or benzodiazepine abuse, they initially using it for sleep. Gradually, they are increasing the dose later, and they are having getting the kicks and having fun, and increasing into daytime usage and getting into drug seeking behavior. I'll just describe an experiment after this later on this topic. Also, on the other hand, the drug seeking behavior can change into therapy seeking behavior. For example, alcohol or opiate use, people, they're usually using it for fun or euphoria, but now when they stop using it, they're having that withdrawal symptoms, feeling drowsy, and alertness is decreased in the daytime, not being able to work or something. So they again start using it to decrease the symptoms. So in a nutshell, it is not very easy to differentiate or separate exactly what kind of pattern that person is showing at that particular cross-sectional time. Like if we come to the previous nosology that we're describing, addiction, if we go by nosology only, in addiction medicine and sleep medicine are seem to be separate as far as addiction nosology is concerned. As far as sleep medicine nosology is concerned, we can see that there is minor overlap between sleep and addiction. But in clinical practice or real world practice, when we find a lot of patients having a mixture of both, and it is often very difficult to demarcate that the primary disorder is that of sleep or that of addiction, or often both. So I'll just be describing a very brief experiment, which was a classic experiment done on subjects of insomnia. Like there were two groups, group A and group B, with or without insomnia respectively. Each of these two groups were given 2 nights each with alcohol and with placebo. And after that, after like those 2 nights of alcohol and placebo, they were asked for taking drinks of choice, like color-coded cups were used for 3 subsequent nights. And the doses were 0.2 gram per kg of ethanol on each cup with a maximum of 3 refills every 15 minutes. So what happened was that the insomniacs chose significantly more ethanol refills than those who were not having insomnia. In ethanol reduced REM sleep, like rapid eye movement sleep, for both groups for the 8-hour sleep period. Ethanol in insomniacs increased stage 3 and 4 sleep and reduced stage 1 sleep within the first half of the night to the level seen in the normal Indian population. However, insomniacs also showed a greater reduction in tension and stress with ethanol than the normals. So the question now comes that what will happen to these people once they once the experiment stops? Will they continue taking ethanol as they have found the good effects of helping in insomnia? Will it increase? Will the dose gradually get escalated because some of them will also discover the euphoric effects of alcohol and continue using it and get into substance dependence? Like that. Now the second phase of the study was done, in which they were given a choice as to how much dose can be increased, and they can ask for as much of refill as they can. And the opportunity, like in the first part, there was this maximum of 3 refills are allowed. Now in this second part, the number of refill, person can take as much refill as one. And the results were that after 6 consecutive nights of the same alcohol dose, tolerance developed to the sleep effects. And they were given an opportunity to after 6 nights of prior alcohol exposure, those who are suffering from insomnia, they increased the dose to a much higher level than compared to those who are not suffering from insomnia. So this again validates the previous questions. So now how is exactly is sleep problems and substance abuse related? So sleep problems have been implicated in initiation, maintenance, as well as relapse of substance abuse. I'll just go over very briefly for all of these 3 headings. Like in initiation, as we have discussed, self-medication for insomnia gradually leads to tolerance and dose escalation. Some of them recognize euphorogenic effects, get into the dependence pattern. Also, slow wave sleep deficiency have been associated with development of alcoholism, like in those people who have a high genetic loading for substance abuse or alcoholism, son of people taking alcohol and all. When those children and adolescents were studied for their sleep patterns, it was found that there was a slow wave sleep deficiency was there, and they later on started to develop alcohol dependence syndrome also. Now for maintenance, again this self-medication continues, like relief from excessive daytime somnolence, fatigue caused by substance withdrawal like stimulants, etc., as well as the chronic disruptive effects of sleep. For example, like if a person regularly takes alcohol or coffee, that is bound to disrupt the sleep pattern. Also, those with insufficient sleep or circadian rhythm sleep disorders or shift work disorders, they often use stimulants to stay awake, or they use benzodiazepines or alcohol or other sedatives to go to sleep, like just to make their cycle of sleep and wake in tandem with their either professional or circadian pattern. Now, these often predispose them to substance abuse. Also, REM sleep deprivation have found that there is increased pain sensitivity. Now, opioids, when are taken, the relief pain, but on the other hand, opioids also suppress REM. So, with gradual like need for increasing the dose of opioid, that is the tolerance for opioids, does it have something to do with REM suppression? That is a question that needs to be answered later. Now, this can again lead to dependence that way. Also, as far as relapse is concerned, slow levels of slow wave sleep are predictive of alcohol relapse. This has been proved beyond doubt. Now, increased REM sleep percentage or shortened REM sleep latency is often predictive of relapse. So, after this, we come into the we'll just go briefly over the neurobiology of sleep as well as addiction. I won't go into much details because everybody is aware of that. I'll just mention here briefly so that I can collaborate the findings later on. So, as we are seeing in this graph that like this is just a 2-day cycle in which the processes, there are two processes, process S like the homeostatic pressure and process C, the circadian rhythm for the sleep, that is being shown graphically. And this black area here, this is the period of sleep that is here from 11 p.m. in the night till 7 a.m. in the morning, and subsequently that way it is just shown graphically. Now the process C, which keeps on fluctuating, which reaches a peak at around say daytime, and again comes down at the time when the person is falling asleep. Again it reaches starts reaching peak in the morning. Like this is a circadian pattern. And the process is, that is the homeostatic drive for sleep, that goes on increasing till the person is awake, reaches a maximum or a tip, and then decreases once the sleep starts. Now, what happens if the person is not able to sleep at the night? In the next day, it is seen that from 11 to 7, the person is doing a night shift of walking, so the person not being able to fall asleep, but circadian rhythm is doing its normal function on that particular day. But homeostatic drive, the process is it is elevated. There is an additional sleep pressure that is building on, and now when the person gets to fall asleep on the third day night at 11 p.m., what happens is that the sleep has a certain distinct pattern. Like there is increased slow wave, slow wave activation, as well as increased total sleep time. So that is just in brief about the, what happens in the background when you are sleeping or waking up. And also just to briefly mention about this thing, that this process C, that is circadian rhythm, is guided by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which receives photic input from the retina via the retinohypothalamic tract. And what happens at the molecular level is that the circadian rhythms are maintained by several core clock genes, which have which work in a transcription factors that regulate their own expression in a negative transcriptional translational feedback loop, and maintains an approximate 24-hour oscillation. Now, I should mention here also that in humans, the actual cycle for circadian cycle is not 24 hours; it's 24.56 or something hours, and thereby lies the need of resetting the biological clock every day, and the role of external cues or jet givers. Now, coming to the process C in details, like I have just copied and pasted this picture. This picture is very popular Stall's textbook on psychopharmacology. I will not go into very details. We have to find what happens in the sleep and what happens in wake time. There is this circadian switch, the on switch and the off switch. Now, what happens in the on switch is that this suprachiasmatic nucleus and tumeromammillary nucleus, these things, and there is also the lateral hypothalamus and the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. Now, these are the four important components that take part in this sleep and wake switch. Now, in wake part, the TMN releases histamine into the cortex as well as into the VLPO sleep center, which inhibits the VLPO sleep center, and the person remains awake. Now, what happens in sleep is that this VLPO sleep center secretes GABA into the TMN or wake promoting center, thereby inducing sleep. Now, exactly how this switch is flipped or flopped, that is a different issue that is under debate, that whether there is this role of homeostatic drive also involved in it, or it is independently done by process C. As well as there are other theories as to an intermediate stage of this sleep-wake on-off switch, as has been described in various models or theories of insomnia, like age exchange model, etc., which I am not describing now for brevity. Now, process is basically the homeostatic sleep drive. It deals with a lot of it deals with basically two things. First thing is the somnogen, like that is these are some chemicals which are released or secreted in the brain, which builds up and gradually increases the sleep drive. And when a certain critical point is reached, the person falls asleep. So, what are those somnogens? The earliest somnogen that has been discovered is basically adenosine, which act on the adenosine 2A receptors and have been identified. These receptors have been identified in the sleep promoting neurons of the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. Now, this adenosine, now just if you kindly look at this particular picture, that adenosine and caffeine, they share a very much like structural similarity, and the result is that caffeine is a physiological antagonist of adenosine molecule, and that is the reason why like we all take coffee or caffeine to stay awake. Basically, what it does is the coffee displaces adenosine receptors, thereby decreasing the homeostatic sleep drive. Now, later on, like a couple of decades back, research were being done, and now they found out that adenosine is not actually the primary component. The primary component is like prostaglandin D2, which is secreted by the like leptomeningeal prostaglandin synthetase enzymes in the leptomeningeus, choroid plexus, and oligodendrogliocytes. And this PGD2 actually interacts with the DP1 receptors on the leptomeninges and like in the basal forebrain, and they then cause the synthesis of adenosine or release of adenosine into the particular bloodstream. And it has been seen that DP1 knockout mice, they do not exhibit PGD2 induced sleep, nor does adenosine concentration increase in those particular group of mice. Also, another group of somnogen has been, some research has been done in that, in 1 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. They were of the most potent somnogenic substances, but the problem is that there were inconsistencies in the reports of how much effective they are in the, like when in general population, though their importance in those who are suffering from illness or some inflammatory conditions, that has been proven beyond doubt. Another part of process is like synaptic homeostasis. Basically, what happens is that if you look in the first picture, like this is a picture of a sleep period. In the first part is the non-REM 1 cycle, and then is the rapid eye movement cycle, and then again is the non-REM 2 cycle. Now, during this REM and non-REM cycle, what happens is that potentiation occurs as a result of slow wave sleep activation, because when a person falls asleep or in deep sleep, that is stage 3 or slow wave sleep, synaptic potentiation occurs. Also, it has been seen that in the same non-REM sleep, there is also like downscaling of the synapses. So now, how are these two correlated? These things can be understood by this graphical model. It shows that in the deep sleep stage, there is synaptic potentiation. This black line, this is the potentiation. And now in the REM sleep, what happens is that the unnecessary synapses are just being pruned while keeping the most relevant information, but which are consolidated. That is, the black line is still higher in the REM 2, but at a lower level than that was present in non-REM 1. Basically, to make things a bit more clear, I have added the second picture also. This is basically, for example, say during awake time, there are lots of synapses are being prepared while the person stays awake, indulges in various activities and all, including addiction processes. A lot of synapses are being created, each of which costs energy, space, as well as synaptic saturation. Now, if we add these three, say for these are just arbitrary 100, 150, and 5. Now, at the time of sleep, the brain gets rejuvenated. What happens is that the important synapses are kept, while the unimportant or those which are deemed non-required by the brain, they are pruned off, and so thereby saving the energy as well as space, as well as like signal is to like increasing the signal is to noise ratio, and these things occur which we call as synaptic downscaling. Now, these are the patterns that we see. These are the processes that basically regulate our sleep neurobiologically. Now, what we see in sleep deprivation, we see that after sleep deprivation, changes in sleep patterns vary with the duration of sleep loss. Increased NREM sleep, like increases in NREM sleep delta power, that is basically increase in slow wave activity, occurs after relatively brief periods of sleep deprivation. And sleep deprivation, however, if chronic, like leads for several weeks, they lead to mainly a rebound of REM sleep rather than the NREM sleep. Now, unlike NREM sleep, the REM sleep is compensated for by increasing the amount of REM, not the amount of sleep. Now, overall sleep time tends not to increase significantly after sleep deprivation, but REM starts displacing the non-REM sleep, and there is this high homeostatic REM sleep pressure, that is the REM onset becomes less. So what does we mean by all this data? Basically, we can correlate it in clinical practice. Is that when a person say is abusing alcohol, and the alcohol is disrupting sleep architecture, and chronically there is this REM deprivation. So when the use stops, or when the person stops taking the alcohol, what happens is a REM rebound, and REM rebound is basically increase in the quantity or percentage of REM sleep, as well as increase of like the REM sleep, which is supposed to come later in the later half of the night, comes very early in the night, and this has been again correlated with subsequent relapse. So that is just one example to make things a bit clearer. Now I'll come to the very with the brain's addiction pathway. This is basically prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens, our reward center, and the ventrotegmental area, the site of all neurotransmitters, mostly like dopamine, etc. So now what happens is that drugs, what they do is that they hijack our own brain's mechanism of pleasure-induced dopamine release at the nucleus accumbens, and they give a very rapid high. They give a very rapid high, and like instead of working a lot to get a little amount of pleasure, drug users use the drug and get that instant kick and the high, which helps them gives them the pleasurable sensation. Then what happens? The brain tries to adapt by making the dopamine less effective, like tolerance. And once the cell has become adapted, it becomes less responsive. So gradually they are left with insufficient neurotransmitters to function, and increases the drive for and craving for more drugs. Also, there is the role of stress, or by stress here actually what I have meant is that like negative affectivity, which is basically a trait level thing in which the person's negative emotions, for example, anger, self-doubt, and depression and anxiety, all these things basically change the person's perception, as well as like view of the world, as well as the person's view of the self. So these things has been ascribed to a trait level and are present in various people in various amounts, and have been found to be increased in substance abusers significantly, like statistically significantly. Now, what happens as stress or negative affect? What they do is that they just increase the CRF, which again increases anxiety. Like CRF is a cortisol releasing factor, and it leads to drug use, decrease of CRF, and subsequently decrease in anxiety. Another pathway has been implicated with that deals with substance P and NK1R receptor. So these also the same thing happens. Now, what happens when a person stops taking drugs, or what happens to that negative affectivity is that with prolonged drug use, the CRF level elevates, causes anxiety and withdrawal, and subsequently leads to relapse. Also, basically, till the previous slide, we saw that basically there are two areas of substance abuse related patterns. Like one is this behavioral activation pattern or reward seeking pattern, which I had described previously, and the other one is negative affectivity pattern. These two are the most closely linked biological backgrounds of substance addiction or abuse. Now each of these like the substances, what they do is that they increase various transcription factors, for example FOSB, and that regulate the expression of genes, which in turn initiate a particular cascade of neural events, and thereby accumulating in the brain and causing changes in the neural circuits, like long-term potentiation. I'll just skip these slides, but basically what happens is that after a person is using a drug repeatedly, there are changes. There are actually structural changes in the brain, and the number of dendrites and dendritic knobs have sometimes they keep on changing. They are increased or set, and the person becomes physically hardwired for more and more addiction. So what happens, like the difference between a non-addicted brain and an addicted brain, if we go over that, what happens in a non-addicted brain is that the prefrontal cortex, this gives the stimulus to the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, and this impulse is controlled quite significantly by the prefrontal cortex, or like rationality, we can call it like that. And now this controls the behavior, and the subsequent stimulus to the dorsal striatum motor cortex becomes quite minimal, and the result is a person is not taking substances. But a person whose brain is addicted to that particular substance, what happens is that these structures change, like the relative ratio of which circuit is active and overactive is quite different. Now what happens is that the role of prefrontal cortex, or rationality as we say, is quite minimized, whereas the role of amygdala and hippocampus, or emotional valence, this part increases, and this the stimulus given to the nucleus accumbens and VTA on exposure to cues increases, and that leads to a very strong stimuli given to the dorsal striatum and motor cortex, which makes the person change his pattern and take the substance, the person is taking the substance even when without much thinking or much rationality. So how do we collaborate these two biological bases, that of sleep and that of addiction? Basically, we have found, it has been found out that sleep, waking affective states and sleep have a clearly bidirectional relationship, and emotional arousal such as the cingulate cortex, insula, amygdala activation, etc., they can drive specific sleep patterns. For example, amygdala activity has been closely associated with REM expression by sharing reciprocal connections with REM on centers in the pons. Also, REM sleep characteristics have been linked with consolidation of amygdala-dependent learning. For example, we all know increased REM amounts to predict reinstatement of drug-seeking behaviors. Now, what happens in sleep deprivation? Basically, sleep deprivation results in increased activation of the amygdala to negative emotional stimuli and dampened functional connectivity with the medial prefrontal cortex. Basically, what happens in that? It is that sleep is important basically for the ability to regulate the salience of cues that evokes negative affectivity, and more specifically, the cues linked with drug of abuse may elicit a more potent motivational drive in the sleep deprived individual, making him or her more likely to engage in substance seeking behaviors. Like, for example, if a person, two persons are given a choice of taking alcohol, one of them is not has slept quite well the last night, the other one has not. It is there, the possibility is more that the person who has not slept well the last night will take the substance or engage in substance taking behavior. The same thing we have found out in the previous experiment also, which I had described. Now, what about sleep loss and the framework for addictive behavior? It has been found that insomnia and daytime sleepiness were associated with impulsivity in a cohort of college students in 2008 study. Similarly, it has been associated with attention problems and externalizing symptoms. Moreover, acute sleep deprivation has been associated with risky decision making. A PET study found that after one night of sleep deprivation, downregulation of D2, D3 receptors happened in the ventral striatum. So what does it do? It basically, prolonged wake activates synaptic mechanisms that reduce the sensitivity to dopamine, very similarly to the changes that was observed after repeated drug use. Now, another very interesting area and avenue for current research is orexin, orexin and sleep and addiction pathway. It has been found that hypocretin orexin system, which is central for sleep-wake regulation, also been implicated. These drug-seeking behaviors to opiates, alcohol, and nicotine. It has been found that artificial stimulation of hypocretin neurons or orexin neurons was sufficient to reinstate previously place preference for morphine. The experiment was done in rats actually, and to stimulate the extinguished alcohol or nicotine seeking behaviors. Similarly, the same hypocretin receptor antagonists have been found to reduce self-administration animal models. Stimulation of postsynaptic dopamine receptors in nucleus accumbens and other striatal regions, they increase the arousal and delay sleep. Also, increased synaptic dopamine in the striatum induces a homeostatic slow wave response, and thereby potentiating the post-drug administration of slow wave sleep, which is involved in strengthening of the behavioral patterns associated with this drug. Now, if you can just correlate or recollect that the previous slide which I had mentioned, slow wave sleep helps in strengthening the long-term potentiation of the synapses. Now, what happens is that already there is a sleep depth, and there is the person is at increased risk of taking the substance. The person is taking the substance, and then the person is falling asleep. And while the many substances like alcohol, they are increasing the slow wave sleep, and thereby, and as well as causing the increased strengthening of the synapses, thereby hardwiring the brain more and more for the substance taking behavior. Now, after all this talk, that final message, bottom line is this, that the reward systems are reactivated during sleep, leading to offline consolidation of memories with elevated emotional or motivational value, which in turn enhance learning and synaptic plasticity of addiction related behaviors. That is number one. And number two is that prior disposition for insomnia or sleep disturbances incurred by the use of the drug or any chronic sleep debt would cause, number one, a greater sensitivity to drug use. That is, the person will be more predisposed towards drug seeking behavior or drug taking behavior. There will be greater REM sleep rebound, which would again enhance the emotional learning as well as strengthen the drug use. and slow wave activation, which would enhance the neuroplastic adaptive changes in the striatum. So this is just a graphical model in which given by Hairston et al. In 2015, which attempted to correlate or the addiction and sleep medicine aspects of addictive behavior as well as sleep. So basically, what it says is that there is this negative affectivity increases to drug abuse, which gives rise to reward, which increases mesolimbic cortical plasticity. On the other hand, drug abuse or drug use again causes disrupted sleep, which increases the negative effect, thereby going into a feedback loop. On the other hand, disrupted sleep reduces dopamine activity, thereby increasing the mesolimbic cortical plasticity. And on the other hand, this reward causes associative learning of further drug use. And the NREM sleep and the REM sleep, they are they help in this associative learning by changing the brain activity during the slow wave sleep as well as the REM sleep. So how do we measure sleep? Basically, insomnia is diagnosis is clinical, but for other sleep disorders, we have to do what we call as the polysomnography. Just the basic polysomnography consists of EEG, EEG, EOG, electroculogram, and EMG in EMG. Now EEG, the standard leads that are placed are basically F3, F4, C3, C4, O1, M2, and they are placed in unipolar montage with A1 and contralateral auricular leads. And EOG is placed and EMG is placed. With the help of these three groups of electrodes, we can find out whether the person is sleeping or the person is awake, number one. Number two, if the person is sleeping or awake, if the person is sleeping, if whether the sleep is in the non-REM sleep or in the REM sleep, and if in the non-REM sleep, what stage it is, depending upon various criteria and parameters that have been described in the world of field of sleep medicine. Now, this is what something what looks in a patient on whom polysomnography is being done, and this is how this graph happens. There are also other aspects like pulse oximeter and periodic limb movement leads, and a lot of other gadgets are being used for a lot of diagnosing other sleep disorders, which I won't be discussing here at this point. So, however, it must be noted that insomnia is definitely a clinical diagnosis. And this is a picture of a normal sleep in a 8-hour EEG recording in a healthy person. Like we can see that the person is awake, then the person getting into stage 1 sleep, then stage 2 sleep, and then slow wave or stage 3 sleep, and then again stage 2, stage 1, then the REM sleep, and this cycle continues. The point to be noted is that as time progresses, like towards the later half of the night, the percentage of REM is increasing. The percentage of REM is increasing as well as the slow wave is increasing, whereas the stage 1 and 2 are decreasing. However, this is a very ideal EEG recording ideal normal sleep pattern. In real world practice, it is very rare that this kind of picture will be available. So the things that are relevant with polysomnography parameters relevant with our discussion today are the sleep latency, how much time the person needs to falling asleep after lying on bed, how much time the person requires to for the first REM cycle to start, what is the total sleep time in minutes, what is the sleep efficiency, that is the total sleep time divided by the time spent in bed, what is the percentage of stage 1, 2 and 3 and REM sleep, what are the minutes awake, and how many the arousal or microarousal episodes per hour, and the other things are not that much important for us. So most of the studies on now the second part of the presentation will come into what clinically can be, what is the little data that is available in the various use of various substances and its effect on sleep patterns and sleep cycles. So most of the research is being done on alcohol. It has been shown that alcohol large doses is mildly stimulating on the rising phase of the plasma concentration and is sedating on the declining side of the curve. However, the increased sleep at a low dose, but at a higher dose, the sleep time does not increase because the disruptive rebound wakefulness occurs as a result of the withdrawal. Also, it affects the normal progression of sleep stages and impairs the next day cognitive and psychomotor impairment. Now, what happens in those who are suffering from primary sleep disorders that I had mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation? 30% of persons with insomnia in general population report using alcohol to help them sleep. That is US data. Alcohol consumption was found to be significantly higher in those with insomnia than not in the Indian corporate employees. A study done by 2015 by a Bombay group. Alcohol exacerbates obstructive sleep apnea and can precipitate sleep-related breathing disorders in at-risk persons. And an asymptomatic snorer with no apnea will develop apnea after alcohol use. The risk of periodic limb movement disorder, which is a type of sleep disorder, is increased severely with alcohol, decreases with abstinence, and Also, it causes, like alcoholism causes deficiencies in iron, ferritin, and magnesium, vitamin B12, with polyneuropathy, which again associated with various sleep disorders like restless leg syndrome and periodic limb movement disorders. Now, what are the effects of sleep on sleep of alcoholics and alcohol effects in alcoholics? It has been found that sleep problems, daytime sleepiness, and parasomnias are very common in alcoholics. During binges, alcoholics report polyphasic sleep pattern, like those who do not have any adequate circadian rhythm, like it's very much chaotic. Sleep latency and total sleep time are disrupted on both drinking and discontinuation nights, and increased slow wave sleep and suppression of REM occurs quite rapidly. In acute abstinence phase, slow wave sleep is reduced and REM sleep continuity is disrupted. Now, in recovery and long-term abstinence, these kind of sleep pattern problems or deficits can persist to as long as 3 years, up to 3 years after abstinence. Sleep remains quite shortened and REM pressure remains elevated. Now, what about the treatment of, like, how do we treat the sleep disturbance in alcoholism? Basically the primary sleep disorders in alcoholism, it has been found that often primary sleep disorders, circadian disorders, they are present at a higher rate in alcoholics than in those those who are not using substances. Also, depression and secondary insomnia is often coexistent. Patients often deny their drinking problems and might focus on the sleep problems to avoid confronting their drinking problems. But I think personally that this is a very big area or issue through which we can leverage in our motivation interviewing and get the person into addiction treatment. As far as secondary, those who are having sleep problems because of their alcoholism, that benzodiazepine treatment is entailed with a lot of risks, particularly because of the potential of toxicity and overdose when combined with alcohol, and in case of relapse, it can become dangerous. There is evidence for trazodone up from 50 to 300 mg, gabapentin 900 to 1800 mg, and acamprosate 666 mg per day have been used with good results. All of them have resulted in increased subjective sleep time in total sleep time by polysomnography recording. Gabapentin also improved relapse score, as well as acamprosate improved wake after sleep onset and slow wave sleep, that is stage N3. Moreover, CBT-I, like CBT insomnia, is a special type of CBT that is used in patients of insomnia in sleep medicine. This improved sleep without interfering with the drinking outcome. So, coming to the other substances, I must mention that data is extremely rare as to, there are very few studies. Most of them were done quite a long time ago as to the different effects of effects of sleep on different substances and vice versa. In cocaine, we can see a suppression of rapid eye movement sleep, decreased total sleep time, increased time to first REM sleep, followed by a rebound specific to REM sleep. Modafinil up to 400 mg per day improved those sleep problems by improving sleep latency, excessive daytime somnolence, and sleep stages. Similarly, other stimulants like MDMA decreased total sleep time with decreased stage 2 sleep. However, there were no effects of MDMA on N1, N3, and REM sleep. Amphetamines have a very similar pattern like MDMA. However, the points that must be mentioned here is that lower doses of amphetamines decrease REM latency and REM percentage in total sleep time. At higher doses, total sleep time was also decreased. Now, this has to be kept in mind. As a psychiatrist, we do have to prescribe quite some amphetamines in patients of ADHD and all. Now, cannabis, the effect on sleep is dubious. Basically, I've separated the literature on the two components, 9-THC, 9-delta THC, and cannabidiol. Now, 9-delta THC causes a slight residual sedation without much impact, whereas cannabidiol has a mild activating effect by its action on hypothalamus and dorsal raphe nucleus. Now, as far as heroin or opioid is concerned, it leads to delayed sleep latency and decreased total sleep time, increased wake after sleep onset, reduced REM latency, and minimum slow wave sleep. All of these are improved after low dose buprenorphine, which is a very good finding, or fortunate finding. However, high dose buprenorphine again negated the effects. Moreover, opioids in general, including buprenorphine, they do improve restless leg syndrome, and it can, however, worsen obstructive and particularly central sleep apnea. In acute heroin withdrawal, more abrupt transitions from quiet wake or sleeping condition into the awake state have been found, and there is an impeded progression into slow wave or REM sleep state. That is, the sleep entirely persists into stage 1 or stage 2, the light sleep stages. As far as nicotine is concerned, it causes a dose-dependent increase in wakefulness and a reduction in rapid eye movement sleep. A number of arousals, awakenings, and sleep stage changes were all increased during the cessation week, and nicotine replacement therapy using 24-hour nicotine patch improved slow wave sleep and reduced the urges for smoking compared to a 16-hour patch which was removed at night time. Moreover, In non-smokers, the nicotine patch, or using the nicotine patch, the effects are very similar to that of like using nicotine or cigarettes, and it disrupted sleep with all the previous characteristics. Now, caffeine prolongs the sleep onset, reduces total sleep time in healthy normal subjects, reduces deep sleep. REM, however, is not affected. Benzodiazepines, they have a short increase, decrease the sleep onset latency, increased awakenings or wake after sleep onset. No differences observed in sleep stage percentages. Lower indexes of fast frequency EEG arousal or micro arousals in NADIM and REM were found in benzodiazepine dependence and abuse, and much lower levels of CAP. CAP is basically cyclical alternating pattern, time, and CAP rate. This is cyclical alternating pattern is basically a hallmark of chronic insomnia, which is basically nothing but periods of micro arousal in all PSG parameters, which tends to repeat after a few seconds till a few minutes time. The arousal pattern continues, and this basically is related with hypothalamic activity in the brain, hypothalamic brainstem activity. Now, also computer viewing and television viewing also have been found to be sleep disruptive, with computer gaming causing significantly reduced amounts of slow wave sleep with prolonged sleep onset latency with more stage 2 sleep. However, there is no effect of REM, again just like caffeine. And television viewing decreased sleep efficiency, but it did not alter any sleep pattern. So that's all. Thank you.